Disc and Dat, the format store that picked wrong. In 1988, as compact discs were rapidly overtaking vinyl records and cassette tapes seemed destined for obsolescence, two entrepreneurs from Portland, Oregon, believed they had spotted the next revolution in home audio. Dave Mitchell and Sarah Chen opened Disc and Dat, a specialty electronics retailer that would focus exclusively on what industry experts were calling the future of personal music, digital audio tape, or DAT. Their 2,400-square-foot store on Northwest 23rd Avenue became ground zero for a format war that would ultimately claim their business as collateral damage. Mitchell, a former audio engineer at Tektronix, and Chen, who had managed 3 Tower Records locations, were convinced that DAT's superior sound quality and recordability would make it the dominant consumer format by 1992. They invested their combined savings of $180,000 into inventory, fixtures, and a lease that seemed like a bargain for what they expected would become Portland's premier destination for cutting-edge audio technology. The store's name itself reflected their hedge-betting strategy. While DAT was their primary focus, they'd also carry compact discs to bridge customers into the digital future they were certain was coming. The digital audio tape format that Disc and Dat championed represented a genuine technological leap forward, which made their confidence understandable even if it proved misplaced. Sony had developed DAT technology in 1987, creating a system that could record and play back audio at CD quality while using cassettes roughly half the size of traditional analog tapes. The format supported multiple sampling rates, including the professional standard 48 kHz used in recording studios, and could store up to 2 hours of digital audio on a single tape. Professional musicians and sound engineers immediately embraced DAT for its ability to make perfect digital copies without the generational loss inherent in analog recording. The tapes themselves were marvels of miniaturization. Metal particle media housed in protective shells with automatic write-protect mechanisms and track indexing capabilities that far exceeded anything available in consumer audio. For Mitchell and Chen, these technical advantages seemed overwhelming. Why would anyone choose the inferior sound quality of cassettes or the inability to record onto compact discs when DAT offered the best of both worlds? Their store reflected this conviction, featuring listening stations where customers could compare the crystal-clear reproduction of DAT against other formats, usually with dramatic results that left audiophiles converted on the spot. The initial reception for Disc and Dat exceeded even Mitchell and Chen's optimistic projections, as Portland's music enthusiasts and early adopters flocked to experience what many considered a revelation in home audio. The store's opening month generated $47,000 in sales, with DAT decks from Sony, Technics, and Iowa flying off the shelves despite price points starting at $599 for entry-level models and reaching $1,200 for high-end units. Professional musicians from Portland's thriving music scene, including members of bands that would later achieve national recognition, became regular customers, using DAT to create demo recordings that rivaled studio quality. The store's customer base initially expanded beyond just musicians to include classical music enthusiasts who appreciated DAT's extended dynamic range and complete absence of tape hiss, as well as early adopters of home theater systems who used DAT decks to create perfect digital copies of movie soundtracks and concert videos. By December 1988, Disc and Dat had sold over 300 DAT decks and thousands of blank tapes, prompting Mitchell and Chen to expand their floor space and add a second employee. Local newspapers featured the store in articles about Portland's embrace of new technology, and electronics magazines cited Disc and Dat as an example of specialized retailers successfully serving niche markets. The partners were so confident in their trajectory that they began planning a second location in Seattle for 1990. However, even as Disc and Dat enjoyed its early success, the forces that would ultimately doom both the store and the DAT format were already mobilizing in corporate boardrooms and congressional hearing chambers across the country. The Recording Industry Association of America had identified DAT as an existential threat to music sales, arguing that the format's ability to make perfect digital copies would enable widespread piracy and devastate album sales. Unlike analog cassette recording, which introduced noticeable quality degradation with each copy, DAT could theoretically allow a single CD to be duplicated thousands of times with no loss in sound quality. The RIAA's lobbying campaign reached fever pitch in 1989, with industry executives testifying before Congress that DAT would destroy the economic foundation of the American music industry. This political pressure campaign culminated in the Audio Home Recording Act of 1992, which required all DAT decks sold in the United States to include serial copy management system technology that prevented users from making digital copies of digital copies. While this compromise allowed DAT to remain legal, it also added manufacturing costs and complexity that made the format even less appealing to price-conscious consumers. More damaging to Disc and Dat's business model was the chilling effect this controversy had on major electronics retailers, many of whom decided to avoid DAT entirely rather than risk antagonizing the powerful music industry. The regulatory challenges facing DAT might have been surmountable if not for a more fundamental problem that became increasingly apparent by 1991. Consumers simply didn't value the features that made DAT technically superior. While Disc and Dat's customers consistently praised DAT's sound quality in controlled listening tests, real-world usage patterns revealed that most people couldn't distinguish between DAT and CD audio when using typical home stereo systems and speakers. The format's recordability, which Mitchell and Chen had assumed would be a major selling point, proved less compelling than anticipated because most consumers were content to purchase pre-recorded music rather than create their own compilations. More problematically, the music industry's fears about DAT proved largely unfounded because very few pre-recorded DAT albums were ever manufactured. Without content, even the most sophisticated playback technology became irrelevant. By 1991, fewer than 2,000 album titles were available in DAT format compared to tens of thousands on CD, and major record labels were actively discouraging DAT releases to avoid legitimizing the format. Disc and Dat found itself in the impossible position of selling premium-priced hardware for a format that lacked software support, while simultaneously trying to educate customers about technical benefits they couldn't perceive in their own listening environments. As DAT's prospects dimmed, Mitchell and Chen attempted to diversify Disc and Dat's product mix, but their efforts were consistently undermined by their talent for backing the wrong horse in format wars. In 1992, they became early advocates for digital compact cassette, Philips's attempt to create a DAT competitor that used familiar cassette-sized cartridges while offering digital recording capabilities. DCC decks could play traditional analog cassettes while also supporting the new digital format, which seemed like the perfect bridge technology to ease consumer adoption. Disc and Dat invested heavily in DCC inventory and marketing, creating elaborate displays that demonstrated the format's backward compatibility and convenience advantages over DAT. However, DCC suffered from compressed audio that, while better than analog cassettes, couldn't match CD quality, and the format was discontinued after just 3 years of poor sales. The partners' next bet was on MiniDisc, Sony's magneto-optical format that combined the convenience of cassettes with digital audio quality and innovative features like track editing and instant random access. MiniDisc seemed more promising than their previous choices. The discs were small, durable, and re-recordable, while the players offered skip-free playback that made them ideal for portable use. Unfortunately for Disc and Dat, MiniDisc achieved only modest success in the United States, finding a niche market among musicians and some portable audio enthusiasts but never approaching mainstream adoption. The store's financial situation became increasingly precarious as each format bet failed to materialize into sustainable sales volume. DAT deck sales, which had peaked at 47 units per month in early 1990, dropped to fewer than 12 per month by 1993, while margins on the hardware continued to shrink as manufacturers struggled to reduce costs for a format with minimal market penetration. The blank media that had once provided steady recurring revenue became a liability as Disc and Dat was forced to maintain inventory for multiple incompatible formats, each with slow turnover and limited shelf life. DCC's rapid discontinuation left the store with $23,000 in unsaleable inventory that had to be liquidated at severe losses, while their MiniDisc investment, though not a complete failure, generated insufficient volume to offset declining DAT sales. Perhaps most damaging to the business model was the opportunity cost of their specialization strategy. By focusing exclusively on advanced audio formats, Disc and Dat missed the explosive growth in CD sales that sustained mainstream electronics retailers throughout the early 1990s. While competitors like Circuit City and Best Buy were building massive customer bases selling CD players and discs with healthy margins and huge selection, Disc and Dat remained committed to formats that appealed primarily to audio enthusiasts and professional users. Their customer base, while passionate and knowledgeable, was simply too small to support the overhead of a retail store, especially as online communities began providing the technical expertise and product advocacy that had been Disc and Dat's primary value proposition. By 1994, it became clear that Disc and Dat's specialized focus had become a liability rather than an asset as the consumer electronics industry moved toward standardization around CD audio and away from the format proliferation that had characterized the late 1980s. The store's attempts to expand into related product categories consistently failed because their brand identity was so strongly associated with failed formats that many potential customers assumed anything Disc and Dat endorsed was destined for obsolescence. Their brief foray into selling high-end CD players and accessories generated modest sales, but attracted complaints from longtime customers who felt the store was abandoning its mission as a champion of advanced technology. The emergence of home computers with CD-ROM drives created new opportunities for digital audio manipulation and recording, but Disc and Dat lacked the technical expertise and vendor relationships to compete effectively in the computer market. Most significantly, the rise of the Internet began providing audio enthusiasts with alternative sources for technical information, product reviews, and purchasing options that undermined the educational role that specialty retailers like Disc and Dat had traditionally filled. Online forums and early websites offered more comprehensive format comparisons and technical specifications than any physical store could provide, while mail-order companies could offer better prices by avoiding retail overhead costs. Mitchell and Chen recognized that their business model was becoming obsolete, but their financial resources were too depleted to fund a successful transition to online sales or a broader product mix. The final chapter in Disc and Dat's story unfolded with depressing inevitability throughout 1995, as declining sales, accumulated inventory losses, and the emergence of new audio technologies combined to make their situation untenable. The introduction of recordable CD technology effectively eliminated DAT's last competitive advantage, as CDR offered similar recording capabilities with vastly better media availability and lower costs per disc. Sony's announcement that it would discontinue several DAT deck models due to poor sales created customer confidence issues that further depressed demand for the format that remained Disc and Dat's primary focus. The store's monthly sales had fallen to less than $8,000 by mid-1995, barely covering rent and utilities, while their accumulated debt to suppliers exceeded $67,000. A final attempt to liquidate inventory through aggressive discounting succeeded in clearing their shelves but generated insufficient cash flow to satisfy creditors or fund a business transformation. On November 15, 1995, Mitchell and Chen held a closing sale that attracted dozens of longtime customers, many of whom expressed genuine sadness at losing a store that had introduced them to audio technologies they'd grown to love, even if those technologies had failed to achieve commercial success. The partners auctioned their remaining inventory, fixtures, and equipment for $14,000, barely enough to cover their lease termination costs and final payroll obligations. The rise and fall of Disc and Dat offers a compelling case study in how technological superiority alone cannot guarantee commercial success, especially when consumer behavior, industry politics, and market timing conspire against even the most innovative products. DAT's technical advantages were undeniable. It offered better sound quality than cassettes, recording capabilities that CDs lacked, and professional features that serious audiophiles genuinely valued. However, these benefits proved insufficient to overcome the format's higher costs, limited software availability, and industry opposition that created an ecosystem hostile to adoption. Mitchell and Chen's fundamental error wasn't in recognizing DAT's technical merits, but in assuming that technical merit would translate automatically into market success without considering the broader context of consumer needs, industry dynamics, and competitive responses. Their subsequent investments in DCC and MiniDisc revealed a consistent pattern of prioritizing engineering excellence over market viability, a tendency that might have succeeded in a world where consumers made purely rational decisions based on technical specifications. Instead, they discovered that most people valued convenience, compatibility, and content availability far more than marginal improvements in audio quality or recording flexibility. The store's demise coincided with broader changes in consumer electronics retail that favored large chains with diverse product mixes over specialized stores with deep expertise in narrow categories, reflecting an industry shift toward standardization and mass market appeal rather than technical innovation and niche markets.